Welcome to Aspire to Lead, where we empower educators and school leaders to grow, inspire, and thrive. I'm your host, Joshua Stamper, author, speaker, and leadership coach, bringing you conversations that spark transformation, challenge the status quo in education, and equip you to make a lasting impact on your campus or in your district. For more information and resources, visit joshstamper.com as we're looking to ascend to new leadership heights together. All right, welcome back to Aspire to Lead, where I have a good friend of the podcast, Nathan. You must get a jacket or something at this point because you've been on so many different times. I am a huge fan of your work, honored and privileged not only to have you as a guest before, but also to call you my friend. So Nathan, thank you so much for being back on Aspire to Lead.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I think this is my third time, on this podcast. So I think this is like the most I've done any podcast. So we obviously have a lot of alignment.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So congratulations. You've got a second book. I know in the past we've had you on talking about hacking school discipline. It's made a huge impact. I don't even know how many sold as far as copies, but I know it's traveled all over the world. It's made a huge ripple effect in the world, not only of education, but then in other spaces too. So Nathan, before we jump into your new resource, I'd love for you just to give a little update about what's been going on. I think the last time you were on, we were talking about High Five and some of the exciting things that are going on with that company. Yep. But yeah, if you want to update us, that would be great.
Yeah. So, I wrote my first book and it came out 7 years ago. So, since then, what I've been doing a lot is just traveling around and working with school districts and schools directly. A lot of these schools are ones that have been struggling with something with their behavior or needed training, something like that, going on in the schools. So what I would do is I would go to these different schools and I would model some of the practices that I wrote about in hacking school discipline. Some of these different schools had a lot of complexities taking place. So we would go into these different schools and I'd have other trainers with me and we would see different things and coach the educators, but we would learn a lot from the systems. So I became really obsessed with, what works with school discipline and what doesn't work with school discipline. Like, what did I put in this first book that was power tested out there and worked, and what other stuff may kind of need an iteration or something different into it. So looking at all this type of stuff that I did for 7 years, I brought this all together and I put it together in this book, The Science of Discipline. So what it does is it breaks down from lived experiences from myself to work I did as a youth worker for 7 years, what I've done with, the two different schools I've worked at as well. Like, how do you frame discipline in a way that teaches behavior? Doesn't just expect the kid does this and this is the right behavior, this is the wrong behavior, but what is the social norms in the school? How do we form those social norms into the school? And what does that look like as a framework? So that's really what sparked me. And that's my biggest project I've been working on.
All right. So let's talk about when you're walking into a school.
Yeah.
Because obviously I think you said before we push record, you've worked in all 50 states. That's incredible. Yeah. And so what are some of the red flags that you notice in regards to how students and the adults are relating to each other and maybe understanding that, there might be some tweaks or things that are outdated that we need to assist with?
Yep. I would say a lot of times when I first go into a school, you want to see, what the students are saying, what the teachers are saying, what the school administrators are saying, what the other educational support staff are saying. Looking at this information, you quickly get to see trends. Where do they feel supported? Where is things starting to crack? Where do we need to improve systems? And then from there, you start to see, what do we focus on? What is the biggest priority right now? What's the trend across all these different stakeholders? What are the families saying also? So, when I would typically go to a school, we have something called a dynamic needs assessment. What this does is takes these different qualitative factors, looking at different sort of mindsets or feelings, or how do you feel safe in this different building? And then it also looks at quantitative factors. And this is looking at referrals, looking at suspensions, looking at recidivism of behavior. So if a kid brings a vape to school and they do this consequence, do they bring a vape to school again, or do they not bring a vape to school again? And I think that is the success criteria that we're looking for. And then how do we also save more instructional time in the classroom? So I think as an outside provider, anyone coming into a school or someone looking at a school from a new position, maybe joining a school, you want to look at what's typically already going on. So how do you assess the system? Once you assess the system, I think it's then important to create sort of an action plan that every one of these stakeholders that now have put some input into the system understands what will happen next. What does my parents know this is going to happen next? I heard that my teachers are reading this book about these practices. What does that mean for my son or daughter's education? I think when you start to structure this, the parents understand. Then you start to teach the students, if you do this behavior, this is what happens next. You teach the educator, if these behaviors escalate, this is how you are supported from the system, other people within the school. And then I think from there, you start to track the progress of that. So my goal as someone from outside of the school going into the school is understanding the system, helping the system rebuild or heal in a certain area that it can continue on without me around.
Yeah, I think that sustainable model is huge. Typically it's a one and done, and then maybe we have a touch point sometime in the year, but I love what you're talking about. Also with the new book, you write about cultivating accountability instead of compliance.
Yep.
And when I read that, I was like, yes. However, I think there's a huge misconception with thinking that they're one and the same.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk through that and break it down for us in regards to the accountability piece and compliance, but separate, and why you think there's a difference there.
Yep. So I would say when you're thinking about compliance, you are thinking about doing something potentially without a feeling. You just have to do this. And if you don't do this, you're not being compliant. Yeah. So as a neurodivergent person, I just jotted those two things down. So that's compliance. Accountability on the other side, though, is something that doesn't require just blank compliance. Accountability is something that requires someone to take account for their behavior and take action around that behavior based on how that behavior is impacting other people. It also is giving respect to the system at hand. So by saying this, it's saying that the student is the student, the teacher is the teacher. So there's a little bit of, there's the hierarchy. So when the teacher says, I need you to stop doing this behavior, and even if the student thinks they're not doing this behavior, there's acceptable ways to respond, there's unacceptable ways to respond. Does the teacher, once the student does it acceptable or unacceptable way, do they need to force compliance at that time? If it's one of those two different things, that could create opposition. But do they need accountability? Do they need something that is going to show the student that what you did caused harm to me, to somebody else, and this is what you need to do next? So I think when you're breaking down compliance and accountability, you're looking at what is the action and how do both people feel about this? Because if you're focused on compliance, you may use fear to get that compliance to the student. You may use, something where, hey, I'm the adult, don't talk back, things like that. And I understand that, but I think that there's room to give the student a voice and a choice in the situation that creates the accountability loop and doesn't force just blank compliance.
I really want folks to really think through that, because I think there's a lot of assumptions, unfortunately, and you did a beautiful job of breaking that down for us. So one of the core principles that you talk about in regards to discipline is recognizing each child's uniqueness.
Yep.
And a lot of times we have a system of reactivity versus being a little bit more proactive. So when we're looking at a classroom, when student behaviors may be beginning to escalate, what are some things that they can put in place to help with that child uniqueness and being proactive versus waiting until something happens and then falling on the traditional discipline?
Yeah, I would say that every student has, their own uniqueness and their own personality. And I think it's important to, accept their personality and their uniqueness. We are also teaching skills of self-regulation in the schools. And teaching these skills of self-regulation comes with, what are you doing in the classroom? Like, how's your interactions? Where are you sitting? What does things look like? So we're teaching these different skills that will be acceptable later in life. And these are progressive types of skills that these kids are starting to learn. So we want to amplify uniqueness. We want them to feel the sense of personality in their identity, but we also want to help them understand regulation, social norms that are co-constructed with that classroom. And I think in those different social norms creates expectations, accountability, and things like that. So we give respect to the system, but we give respect to the individual as well. I think that when we're thinking about what teachers can do proactively or what they can do to, support, before it gets to quick redirection, I think looking at simple models of redirection, like the preview, the warning, the consequence, where, you see a misbehavior, you preview the expectation, you see the misbehavior again, you give a warning without blame, shame, or embarrassment. You see the behavior the third time, now you give a consequence. And these are for the paper cut, smaller type behaviors. But when you have a framework like this, you're creating a proactive structure where there's expectations already posted that is the social norms of that classroom. if the student breaks one of those social norms of this classroom, I, as the educator, know my first step to do is to preview for the class everything. My second step, warning. Third step, consequence. And then if the behavior happens, warning, consequence, whatever those steps are, whatever the social norms are of that school and the policies and procedures of that school or district as well. So I think that when the teachers know that that's how I handle behaviors and that's my proactive approach to go through, we still celebrate uniqueness. We still teach self-regulation. We still do this type of stuff, but we also have a structure of how we have our classroom to teach, kids what expectations are.
So you touched on neurodiversity with yourself.
Yes.
You talk about it in the book, but I want to know what are some common discipline practices that unintentionally punish neurodiverse students and what should be done instead to replace what we typically do?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I've read about and I personally experience a lot with as a neurodivergent person is I think quickly. And when I think quickly, I sometimes think and I say everything that's going on. But sometimes when I can't think quickly, I don't know what to say later. And I sort of get stumped or I feel, stuck in a situation. In a discipline setting or when I harm someone else, let's say that I'm speaking really fast and I say something and I trip up and I offend somebody. I say something that's offensive. And this person doesn't allow me to sort of correct myself or explain something to go through, I will feel sort of wronged. And then after they explain how I've wronged them, I may not know what to say next because I've sort of lost my train of thought or something like this. So I think that in this example, the way to make something still have a weighted accountability consequence, still teaching something, but letting me have my uniqueness and individualization is, what is the communication strand? Is it when Nathan caused harm when he says something, I give him a redirection. Hey, that hurt my feeling. Can we not talk about that? And then I have a chance to correct what I said at that point and then continue to speak, because then it's not a quick, big, discipline situation. Because if I'm in the classroom and the teacher says, hey, Nathan, you're not supposed to shout out. I understand. I can respect that. I can go through it. But if it goes, Nathan, you shouted out, you're out of here. I respond to that quickly. Or Nathan, don't talk back. I respond to that with, in a situation. So as a neurodivergent person that thinks quickly, and a lot of people think sometimes quickly, what does it look like to still allow me some time and space to process something with a quicker, shorter redirection instead of a longer term consequence?
So I want to push further on that too.
Of course.
So with your own story, and you've shared that I think a couple years ago when the first book came out, just your story as far as generational poverty, trauma, being labeled a bad kid in school, some of the struggles there. So based on your lived experience, I'm curious, was there influence as far as your discipline systems created and how you coach adults today?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that what I noticed, as a adult looking at my childhood and looking at situations, I see how I was born into a situation where there were social norms that my parents and their parents had based on the social structures and resources around them. Were they all the same social resources? No, but they were the same social structures. Because what happens is, social structures stick around even after, you don't need them to go through. So then, for example, sometimes I hoard small things and I don't need to hoard small things. But I remember as a kid taking ketchup packets from a restaurant. Did we need ketchup at home? Probably not. But my mom liked those ketchup packets. So we would take these ketchup packets at the thing. So it's a structure that's still sort of in place. What I've realized is sometimes those structures in family settings or in school settings stick around as well. So in my structure in my home, I was probably being disciplined the same way my father was being disciplined, same way his grandfather is being disciplined, same way maybe his grandfather is being disciplined. So, there may have not been a lot of iterations or changes through those discipline settings. Same thing sometimes happens within the school. So from someone that has came from this channel, and I see this channel now because I understand the other sides of things with traveling around and understanding this, just other people's lived experiences, I start to see the same thing within schools. You see schools that have had systems in place for a really long time, and they keep trying to change different little things and say, we're doing this. But I would say you have to get down to the brass tacks of things. And Are your teachers happy? Are they sticking around? How's your parents feel? How's the students feel? And then look at your academic performance, then look at these different things to go through. And I would say, like, where are schools performing at right now? And if they're not performing well, is it they maybe have these old structures in place, sort of like what I've seen, and maybe some of these different ones there. So I would say I'd notice these things a bit quicker so I can help school systems understand that a bit.
Yeah, your story is very similar to mine, and we definitely had ketchup packets, hordes in the refrigerator. So
Yep.
I can visually see that in my own childhood. So many educators obviously are feeling really exhausted with student behavior. You know this, and now we're in February, which typically is the highest referred month of the year for schools. So when you're working with these educators that are feeling this way, that maybe they're burned out or whatnot, where do you start with them as far as trying to help them see that these trauma-informed practices or approaches are possible and are a benefit to the students that they're working with?
Yeah, I would say the first thing I would do is I would say get together as a collective. So if you're one educator listening to this, how do you get 5 more educators pulled into it? Because I would say everyone needs a system of support. And I would say a system of support, just to clearly define this, is a group of individuals or a group of resources that all are supporting the same thing. So getting 2-3 different educators together and saying, let's understand what is going on with some of our students that are getting kicked out of the classroom a lot or causing a lot of harm to a lot of different individuals. I would say that is a quick action point that you could take as an educator, and starting to have those conversations. Once you see the trends of what the common behaviors are, think about giving structures around those different behaviors. What does it look like? So instead of us getting stressed out and that happened again, I had that kid, I had an educator recently. It was at a training that I was at, and it was halfway through the training, and they raised their hand and they were giving this example of this student. And in this example, they were talking about, well, yesterday, they were doing this type of stuff. And I was like, well, can you walk me through the behavior? And they were like, well, this boy jumped up on the countertop and ran across the countertop and had his middle finger up the whole time and was flipping the whole classroom off as he was running through the countertop. And half the teachers in there they giggled because they knew who the kid was. And then I looked at the teacher's eyes that we're talking about, and she wasn't giggling. Like, she was sad, and she was very stressed out, and she was thinking in her head, I came to this guy's training, I read his book, help me, what's going on with this kid's running across my thing, flipping me off. And she's like, this is happening every single day. There's no respect at all. There's nothing going on to go through. And she's looking for, something that I can help her with. In those types of situations, she didn't know what to do. Every educator should know what to do. There's no room for educators to not know what to do when kids are acting like this. And if you have the school that says, if a kid does this, I think we give them this type of consequence, they need discipline improvement. They need to go through and adapt their systems as a whole, because those kids will take advantage of things. You're going to burn out your educators. You create unsafe environments. And what are we teaching our kids outside of school? Because if we're looking at kids that are graduating high school right now, what are their social constructs? What are they learning? What is their accountability loop? And I go to these schools, and there's different consequences in every single classroom, and half of them are being used, half of them aren't being used. And I'm thinking in my head, this is where kids are learning expectations, because sometimes in the home, they don't even have to sit at a counter to eat. You know what I mean? I remember doing certain things that taught me certain things. So everyone's got different things. So if schools don't have any common expectations, there's no common consequences, and we're having teachers saying, I have a kid running across my counter, flipping me off, and I don't know what to do with it, that's an issue. That means that there's a lack of a system, not a lack of a consequence. There's a lack of an accountability system. So schools have to understand, do they have a system that works? If a kid runs across your counter and flips them off, does every single person know the response? Is it you grab your walkie-talkie, you turn it to channel 2, you say code blue, you get a response within 5 minutes, they come down, they talk to this kid, they implement a consequence, which is either bring him back in with support after they speak with you, or it's pull out and do this consequence outside of here with the family involved with it. Every educator should know. But she said that, this kid was just running back and forth until the bell rang. So she was trying to teach her class, the entire class, and no one could even come to her class and come down. She's like, I was calling and no one responded. So I think that when we say, what do we say to our educators? I think it's not a let's feel good or let's do this type of stuff. I say, let's take action as a collective and come together with other educators and say, what is working in our system? What is not working in our system? And what is our recommendations? You don't have to always read a book or do this type of stuff. I think it's just understanding that you're probably not alone in feeling this way. Talk to other people about it and say, what do we do to build this stuff? Because it's not just hurting the educators, it's hurting the kids. If they don't know what expectations are, it starts to hurt them.
There's a lot of folks that are feeling this way. And so,
yes.
They're tuning in to the podcast because they want to get strategies and things that are going to help them and support them in the classroom or on the school level, or some districts too. So let's talk about the book, because I want to dive in further. Obviously, everything we've talked about is related to the book and the content that's in there. But, people are seeing the title as it's flashing across the screen that says 8 strategies for empowering educators and engaging students. And I would love for you just to give a quick synopsis. Obviously, me and you could talk for another 3 hours. Right. We wouldn't bat an eye. But I also want to make sure that people understand this is a beautiful resource that is going to help them create that construct that you're talking about, that's going to help the individual teacher, but also it's going to ripple down to every student on that campus.
Yeah. That's my hopes. I think that I've done this work quite a bit, across the United States and internationally. And I've worked with these schools that I've seen struggling with the kid flipping off and doing these things and sometimes way worse things, taking place. And I've seen where schools, break down and where discipline systems break down and where educators start to break down. So what I did with this book is I really took the understanding of where are the biggest pain points that I'm seeing within school discipline, where's things not working, and what's solutions. When I was thinking through these different problems, I also thought about lived experiences, because I think that me being a youth worker for my first 7 years after I graduated from college, I realized that, the reason why I stayed a youth worker for that long, it wasn't like the highest pay, it wasn't like the most glamorous type thing, but it was because I was building relationships with these kids and I was making a difference. I would go to like the fair later on in the town of Lafayette, and I would run into, kids that knew me. I mean, I still have kids that, follow me on Instagram and hit me up sometimes when they're struggling, and people that I've known from being a youth worker those first 7 years. So I realized that I got a lot of that passion from my lived experiences. So what I did in this new book was, because in the first book I had a co-author, so both of us kept it, more professional. Like this one, I put more of myself into it. So I got a little bit more of, what I used to believe, how I used to mentor kids as a youth worker. Because, for my first 7 years, I ran the violent offender program, first 3 years of that program. And in that time, I learned a lot of different ways to hold people accountable and doing it without fear, because these are kids that did not have a lot of fears, and they were from 8 to the ages of 21, and these are kids typically returning from Department of Corrections or maybe a residential or maybe probation violation or something taking place, or sometimes just they need emergency shelter care placement, and there's different parts around there. But the unit that I worked on specifically was the violent offender unit. So what I used to do with some of these kids was I would teach them how to understand why they feel this way. I would teach them, what do you do when you feel this way? And then what does society say if you do this? So because some of these kids would say, I don't care about this, and I would do this. And I say, okay, let's think about what society would do. And we'd weigh this out and we'd talk about it. And if that's the life you would want to pursue, then that's the choice that you're going to. You can't change someone's mind by just saying, do good, especially some of these kids that have had different complex lived experiences. So based on some of my complexity, I would be able to pull in some of those lived experiences for these kids. So what I wrote about in these chapters was a lot of those things that I learned. Like, how did I teach respect to a kid that doesn't think about respect? How do I teach somebody how to be kind to someone else after they've done them wrong? How do I teach forgiveness? I have a whole chapter about, what's a framework of forgiveness? Because I think that, there's a lot of different ways we think about forgiveness, but what does it truly look like? And how do we do this in school that's actionable? And I think that taking in my lived experiences, taking in my work as a youth worker, then my work as an educator, being a school administrator, and just seeing things that work and don't work. And then also just those last 7 years traveling around. I think I have learned so much. And I feel like, my purpose now in life is to probably start writing a lot and probably putting content out there and things, because I've been journaling. I have all these different experiences. Last 2 weeks ago, I was up in, Stockton, California, talking to 13 different school districts with, the San Joaquin County office and talking to them about how do we, improve attendance by increasing belonging? How do we create discipline systems to support teachers that feel burned out? What does it look like to create actionable processes to go through? So I think that in this book, I'm trying to push those things out just so people can learn from it.
All right, let's give an update on High Five. So last time you were on, you kind of gave us a breakdown of the services that you provide. So, if someone's interested in, learning more about what you do, maybe they want you to come in for their school district, similar to what you're talking about in California, or assist in some way, what does High Five provide?
Yeah. So what we're focused on with High Five is creating scalable systems in the school that focus on the biggest problems that we're coming across, which we're seeing right now is educators in the classroom having logical restorative consequences. What does it look like when a kid does this behavior? Like after I've done the preview, I've done the warning, I've done this type of consequence. What does it look like over there? So we're developing framework for those types of behaviors. We also have a lot of framework around how do you improve the sense of community in the classroom? What does it look like to build that sense of community, to create accountability within this community and have shared expectations across those different classrooms? How do you focus on improving that belonging and then tracking that with attendance type metrics? So what does that stuff look like? We focus a lot on data with High Five and what does support systems look like? We also support a lot in school suspension settings and in alternative schools. I've opened up now 3 different alternative schools internal into a school district where it was the students that were bypassing the tier 3 supports and they need additional supports. So what I did was I put together 2 different frameworks. One was a long-term framework where some of these kids would be in there potentially all year or longer and learning different skills. And then there's a 25-day type program. We have those, running right now in school districts. And then we also have in-school suspension type modules. So like if a kid goes in there, were vaping or they skipped class or they were disrespectful, they can take this module. And then on top of that, we have wraparound consulting services, professional development, things like that.
All right. So I'm going to change the last question. You've done this before with me, and it's kind of my baseline for aspiring current leaders, but I want to make it specific to the book and I want to make it specific to this conversation. So for the educator consuming this episode and has a challenging student in mind, similar to what you're talking about, right? You're doing the training and the lady was like, I have one that I need to talk about. So they have that challenging student in mind. What's one small trauma-informed move that they can do today, tomorrow, next week that embodies the science of discipline and puts it in action?
I would say next time you notice things feel off with that student, what I would do is become very inquisitive and be inquisitive about yourself, your actions, be inquisitive about the environment, be inquisitive about the student, maybe even asking the student, hey, how's things going? Something like that. But I would say next time things feel a little off, just be more inquisitive and see what happens.
Being curious, not judgmental.
Of course.
All right, man. I love the work you're doing. I want folks to be able to connect with you. I want people to call you up and get you into their school district to work with you because, like I said, you have a ton of wonderful outcomes that are from the systems that you put in place. So obviously we've talked about the company, High Five, and I'll make sure that everything we discussed is in the show notes. But how would you want folks to get in contact with you?
I would say the best way to get in contact with me is going to be on LinkedIn, just my first last name, Nathan Maynard, and High Five. So I'd say that's the best way, or highfive.school. You can reach out to me, on that website. Then also I have scienceofschooldiscipline.com, that website as well. So any of those ways are probably the best for me.
Are you on LinkedIn more these days?
Yeah, I'm going to start posting a lot more too. I travel every week. Like next week I'm on the road. The week after that I'm on the road. It's like I'm balancing everything going on. But I think that people have encouraged me to start sharing these stories more. They're so powerful, and I feel honored to be able to even tell some of these stories and it's not just me doing this work; it's the educators doing it. So I'm sharing a lot of awesome stories that way through my book and these practices.
Of course. Yeah, I've seen more and more educators, especially educational leaders on LinkedIn. So it's a beautiful space for people to interact with you and get more information. So, of course, like I said, we'll have everything in the show notes for folks to be able to connect with Nathan, find out more about his book, the services that he provides through High Five. And of course, Nathan, it has just been an honor and joy to get to know you over, I was going to say probably 7 years. I think when the book came out is when we first connected.
It was, exactly.
Yeah, which is insane. So I just, like I said, I'm honored not only for the work that you've been able to share on this podcast, but then also to be connected with you and like I said, call you a friend of the show. It's just been amazing.
Yeah, I feel the exact same way. It's been great to be able to just text you over the years and collaborate on certain things and going through. So I think we've both learned from each other. So it's been a great journey together.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.